Let's talk about best practices in React. These days, it's not enough anymore to know a little bit about React. You really need to master it. You need to know the things that you shouldn't do and the things that you should do. So that's what I summarized for you in this video. And for the examples, I'm going to use this project here. This is like a to-do app type of project. So I can mark these to-dos as complete. I can remove them. I can add more to-dos if I want. And actually, I just modified this from one of my course projects actually. So some of you may already be familiar with the TrackBack project. I just modified it a little bit so that we can focus on the best practices. And best practices are important because if you make certain mistakes, it can sort of ruin the whole app. So it's important, for example, that we structure the app in a certain way and that we make things reusable in a certain way, right? So things like structure, reusability, consistency, these are all really important in order to create robust web apps. And that is really what, in my view, actually separates a junior React developer with a senior React developer. The senior React developers have internalized these best practices, while the junior React developer will make a lot of these mistakes, right? So let's quickly go through them and I'll explain everything as we go. All right, so if you're ready, let's get started. Now, if you're building a product, you're gonna need analytics. So let's say I have a dashboard here. And so in this space of my dashboard, I wanna have some analytics, some charts, so that the user can gain relevant insights. So I can include one line of code, and what I will get here is the following. This is made possible thanks to the sponsor of today, which is Semaphore. So Semaphore is a more sophisticated solution for analytics. So you can integrate it directly into your own software or app, and you can customize its look so it looks like it's actually part of your app. And let's say your user only wants to see orders that we're using same-day delivery. I can click on this and filter all of the data. You can see all of these cards automatically adjust to what I just clicked, right? So that's pretty slick. Now your users will want to customize pretty much everything here. So what they can do here with Semaphore is change the theme, but also everything else like the order and layout. Let's say I want it a little bit more like this, make this sit more like this, all right? But they can also customize each card here individually. So if I click on the icon here, I can see all of the information for just that card. So here you can see the query for the data of that card. I can change the data source, can come from anywhere. I can even write my query in natural language. And then with Semaphore, I can convert this with AI to a proper SQL query. And here I can actually write SQL to get the data. And very cool, you can now also write Python here so you can manipulate the data that you get back right here as well. But let's say the only thing I want to do here is actually just change this from a donut chart into a bar or line chart. Now after I made changes, I can approve the changes, and now you can see I customized that card. So now after reordering things here and changing this card, I have a different view here, or what Semaphore calls a lens. So I want to save this particular view. So I'm going to add this lens here, different order and a bar chart. I'm going to save it. So next time I come back, I still see this default view or lens, but now we have the third icon here. I can click on this particular lens that we just saved, and now I get my view back, and I can also set this as the default. And then all of the filtering and things like that still work as well, right? You can add Semaphore with a single line of code. So I would say check it out for your analytics solution, whether you're building a SaaS or e-commerce platform, financial or healthcare type of software, or any kind of software really, and you want to give your users a sophisticated analytics solution. And Semaphore recently released their AI feature. So here, for example, we can chat with an LLM and we will get some information here, right? So the user can just talk with an assistant essentially and get the specific data that they're interested in, and they can then actually add that here to the rest of the dashboard, right? So then here they can click on the button and it will be added with the rest of the cards, right? So very slick. I would say check out Semaphore. You can find a link in the description. The features that I just showed you were just the basics. You can do much more. So I would say check out Semaphore's website. You can find a link in the description, and make sure you sign up for the waitlist. All right, number one is about hard-coded values, or what people sometimes also call magic numbers or magic strings. So let's say here in the add a to-do form that I have here, let's say I have a component for that, the add to-do form, right? Makes sense. And in here, what we want to do is we want to keep track of whatever the user wrote, right? Just keeping track of that. And then here, when the user actually submits the form, we want to add the actual to-do to the list, right? So if I type here add to-do, it should actually be added to the list here. So we are hooking into that submit event that happens on the form when you actually click on a button in the form. And if you remember, it will by default, the browser will try to sort of awkwardly refresh. So we prevent that. And then we can do something like this where we try to set it, where we try to add it to all the to-dos. I removed some things from here just to make the example that we talk about a little bit clearer. That's why I have some red squiggly lines here, but that's okay. But something like this, right? Now, before we actually update the to-dos, maybe maybe what we want is we want to monetize our app. So a free user, a guest user, can only add 3 to-dos. If they want to add another one, a fourth one, they need to be logged in, let's say, and maybe even on a particular subscription plan, but for sure logged in, right? So what we want to do is we would want to do something like, if the number of to-dos, right, so to-dos.length, if that is already 3, right, is that if that is 3 and the user is not logged in, right, so something like is authenticated, right, we could use some authentication solution and we will know if the user is logged in or not. But let's say that's not the case, then we want to alert something like this. You need to sign in to add more than 3 to do. So this will work. Now, the thing is that here we are hard coding a value, the number 3. Is that a good idea to put the number 3 sort of in the component here? Is this going to scale well? Which means if I create potentially hundreds of more components that also need certain values like this, is that a good idea? So I would say it's not a good idea. I would say it's a better practice to define these hard-coded values somewhere else so that they're easier to manage. Let's say that we do it like this, and now later I decide, you know what, a free user should be able to add 10 to do. So now I would like to change that. So now I have to remember, oh yeah, where did I leave that number again, right? So now I would potentially have to open up a bunch of components because I don't know exactly where I left that, right? So when you're hard coding these values sort of deeply inside your component tree to manage all of that. So I would say it's a better practice to define these constants or hard coded values or magic numbers or magic strings, to define those outside the component. And typically these are written in capital case, right? We could call it something like maximum free to-dos, right? And then you would use that variable instead of the actual hard-coded value here. And I could even make this a template literal so that we actually have a nice dynamic string here, right? Something like this. And now the benefit is if I, manage the app and I'm like, yeah, maybe a free user should be allowed to add more than 3. Well, now it's a little bit easier to find. It's now at the top of the file instead of, somewhere deeper down here. So that's already an improvement, I think, that it's at the top of the file. But I think it would be even easier to manage if we actually put this in a dedicated file together with all the other hard-coded values that we're going to use. So what some people like to do, and what I also like to do, is actually create a separate folder. And we'll talk about folder structure in a second as well. But what I like to do is I like to have a folder here for components. And then here I have one that I call library. And I have some things in here already. But one of the other things that we could create here is simply a constants.ts file. And in here, I can put that right here. Now, if I want to use it in another file, I do have to export it. And then if you want to use it from another file, I can remove it from here. I do have to import it from there. So now this will work the same, but now it's not in a component file or even in the component. It has been extracted out of the component and it will now have its own dedicated file. So now if I want to change something like that, typically business logic type of values, I know where to find them because I have a dedicated file for them and I can easily change it to 10 here. And everywhere where it's used, it's automatically updated, right? That's another benefit, by the way, which is that if you leave it at 3, right? So if you do it actually like this, where I'm actually using it in 2 places here, now let's say it should actually become 10, right? So if I hard code it like this, I may even forget that I have the number 3 here as well. But if you actually use variables for this stuff, if you actually make a change to 10 here, it will automatically be correct in all the places where you use it, right? So maybe a bit silly, but I think it's good to talk about that. This is a number value, but some other examples could be, for example, if we want to check if the user is actually writing some sensitive words in their to-dos, for example, right? Just a silly example here again. We are hard coding these 2 words now, password and credit card, right? So if the user is typing those, maybe we want to give a pop-up or maybe give them a warning or something, maybe not even return, but let's say something like this. So now I'm hard coding these 2 strings here, but what if we notice that users are leaking other sensitive data and we want to add more words, let's say. So now I have to find, oh yeah, where did I keep that list of sensitive words? Well, it's going to be buried somewhere in some component here. Also not great. It's easier again to manage that outside the component, these 2 hard-coded strings, right? So it's easier to just have an array, let's say, of sensitive words, right? So here you define all the words that are sensitive. So if you want to add another one, well, you know where to find it and you can easily manage that here. And so then here you can just check if that array of sensitive words, if the content if the content of the to-do is included in that, something like that. So now I have one file where I manage all of that, those hard-coded values, instead of burying them randomly scattered throughout my component tree. And also, if I do change them, wherever I use those constants, they are automatically updated. So every instance will automatically be up to date as well. I think that's not a big benefit. One other example I want to give you here has to do with when you initialize the state, for example. So here we want to keep track of the to-dos, right? So that's a piece of data that we need to keep track of over time that we want to change. So that is a good use case for useState. That is indeed what we're using here in the app. Now, I changed some things, so we're going to have a bunch of red squiggly lines. So let's say we have some state here for to-do. So here initially now it's going to be an empty array. Maybe I do want to start off with some initial to-dos. Now, this is also something that people will often define in a constant. So what you could do is you can say initial to-dos, something like this. So here I defined initial to-dos, and then I can use that to initialize the state, right? So here you also have sort of like a constant, and I defined it outside the component here, right? So the component is just that function, right? That's the component, and it's not the file, right? So this is just a file. But the actual component is just the JavaScript function essentially in React. Now I could define it also inside, right? So sometimes you have arrays and objects that you want to define somewhere. Technically, I could do it in the component. I think it looks a bit messy, and also it's not a huge problem, but it will be recreated on every render, right? So every array or object that you write, that you define inside the component function here, will be recreated when it re-renders. Now for a small array like that, that's not a problem. Now if you have a bigger array or object, it could be a performance issue in that case. And also if you use an array or object as a dependency, for example in a useEffect dependency, since you're going to recreate that object or array every render, it's going to be different every render. So as a dependency, it will not behave as you want, because if it's a dependency and it's different, it's going to trigger a run of that useEffect, for example, right? So typically when you define these constants for arrays or object, you typically also want to do it outside the component and maybe also in a constants file here. For this one, I kind of like if it's close to where I actually use useState, but that is more subjective. All right, let's quickly talk about best practices for folder structure. I noticed especially beginners, they worry a lot about folder structure. And the truth is that you don't really need to worry about it. There is no one, good folder structure and all the other ones are bad. The most important things are that you're consistent with your folder structure and that it makes sense. So the way to think about it, I think, is if a new person joins your team, is it easy for them to understand what's going on? And if it's easy for them, then it doesn't matter how you exactly structure it, it's okay. Now, what I like to do personally is I like to create one big folder for all my components. So here you can see I have a bunch of components here. As your app grows, you will add more and more. So then you can add subfolders in here, right? So maybe all the components that have to do with the header, I'm going to put them in a header folder, right? Just for organizational purposes, I would have an actual header component, but I'm also using the logo component only in the header. So I would also put it in there, for example, right? So you can then further divide that if you want, or by feature, right? So if you have, let's say, authentication feature, so all the components that have to do with authentication, like the auth buttons, maybe a profile component, you're going to put that in a separate folder within here, something like that. Now, typically you also have a folder for state management. So in this app here, I'm using the context API for managing state, in particular the to-dos actually. So the to-dos are managed from a context provider component. Now, technically I could have multiple other contexts. I can create a folder for that. That's why I named it plural here, contexts. If you're not using the context API, but instead you're using something like Redux or toStand for state management, in that case, you would not have context, you would maybe have stores. Right, so you would have a store for your data. Yeah, that's typically where I have another folder for. So then here we have a folder library. So this is essentially a bunch of utilities essentially, right? So here we already saw the constants file, typically also a file for hooks, and actually also typically a file for your helper functions or utils. Helper functions or utility functions, they mean the same things. Like, for example, if you're very often, in many cases in your app, maybe you want to capitalize the first character of the to-do and you do it in multiple components, well, maybe you want to have a function capitalize string, right? That's a utility function or helper function, and you can put that in a utils.ts file. It's something like capitalized first letter, so you can use this wherever you want in your component. You can just pass in a word or a string and it will just give the same word back with the first one being uppercase. And then I have a file here for hooks. It's actually the same, I would say, as a typical utility or helper function. The exception is in a hook, you are using a React hook like useState or useEffect. So typically people put them in a different file called hooks, right? And we call those custom hooks, but they're very similar to a normal utility or helper function. And then also you would have a file for your types, right? So here we would have a to-do type that we would have to use in multiple components. We'll talk more about TypeScript in a second because I consider it a best practice as well. But I think this is a good folder structure to start off with. Now, as your app grows bigger and bigger, usually you're just going to add more subfolders in here, right? So here, maybe we're not using Tailwind CSS, but we're still using a separate CSS file for each component, right? So in that case, I could actually create a folder just for that component. And then I would have a test file for that and a CSS file for that. And that would be just one component. There are no hard and fast rules about folder structure, so don't worry much about it. But as a best practice, you want to make sure that it's easy to pick up for a new person, and it's going to be easy if you are consistent. Things are split by some semantic purpose, right? So a component is different from state management, and state management is different from, constants and types. So these things are separate from each other. They're distinct, and so they are organized differently. Okay, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. Over time, it's pretty obvious what works well and what doesn't. All right, now let's talk a little bit more about components. As a best practice, let me actually remove this. We actually do want to create many components actually. So when should we create a component? So you have to imagine in the real world, what you're going to get is some design from a designer typically, right? So there's a designer and they use a program like Figma or some other design program to create an aesthetically pleasing design, and they will give you that design, and it's up to you as a developer to convert that into working code. So you will receive some kind of like image almost of this design, let's say. We want to create a React app out of that actually works, right? So that you can actually type here and actually, submit something, and so it's actually added to the list. Now, in the world of React, it's all about components, right? So what you want to do is you want to organize the app in components, and a component is just an independent piece of the UI essentially. When I say UI, that's a user interface, right? So it's a user interface because as a user, I'm interacting with this to update the data, right? In this case, the to-dos. What we want to do as a developer is of this UI, what are the independent pieces that make up the entire UI here? And importantly, which pieces are we going to reuse, right? So reusability is something that you're going to hear very often. Now in this app, for example, we have these 3 buttons. So I have one here for add to list, but I'm actually using the same button component for these 2 as well, right? So for the login and register as well. So in React, you want to look for opportunities where you can reuse certain markup, for example, like JSX essentially, and styling. And that's the case here, right? So the markup, the actual JSX and the styling is going to be very similar for these 3 buttons. So it makes sense that we try to create one reusable button component for them. And it has many benefits. If we now make one change, if these buttons need to have a different border radius, for example, I only have to update it in one place. And wherever I'm using that button component, it will be updated properly. Right? There are many benefits to reusing one component when you can. So since the differences here are very small and subtle, it makes sense that we try to put that in one component. Now in practice though, realistically, there are going to be many components that you're never going to reuse. For example, I have a sidebar component for the entire right part here. I'm never going to reuse that, but I still created a component for that just for organizational purposes. Same for the header here, right? I just have one header component. I'm never going to reuse that, but I still created a component for that because it's just better for organizational purposes. Right, so as a best practice, you do want to create a lot of components, certainly for things that you're going to reuse. I would say even if you're only going to reuse it once, I would still create a separate component for that. But also, in addition to that, you want to create components when it helps you with organizing the markup and the JSX, even if you're never going to reuse it. So just as an example, here in the app, if I scroll down here, you can see that here, well, this is actually pretty easy to analyze, right? You can sense that this is well structured. I have a component here for background heading, right? That's actually this thing behind here. If I open that up, you can see it's actually just an H1, right? With to-do app here, it's styled in a certain way, so it looks a bit cool here. But you can see I'm never reusing this, right? So I'm only using this in one place, but I still put it in a separate component because if I now want to see how my app is structured, I can just go to the app component, and here I can see, oh, background heading. So I know what this is because of the name of the component here, right? This is much better than if I didn't create a component, right? So if I just copy and paste this, if I just have an H1 here, you can already sense that now it's a bit messier already, right? So here I have a bunch of extra markup now. Yeah, I see it's an H1, but what does this H1 actually do? Whereas if I actually make it into a separate component, now I know, oh, there's going to be some heading and that's meant for like a background heading. So there's more semantic meaning that I can extract from this. And it cleans up the component a little bit more. And the same is true for the footer here, for example. Right, so if I open up the footer here, there's a bunch of markup here. It's just for the footer here that we have at the bottom, and it's just a bunch of markup essentially. I'm never reusing this, right? But this looks much better than if I would put it right in here, right? You can see the app becomes much more messier if I put all the markup, right? So instead, it's much cleaner if we just make a component out of that, right? And the same for the header and sidebar, right? Header, sidebar, and the to-do list as well. I'm not reusing that anywhere, right? I'm only using that once, but it's nice that we have separated those things out into a separate component just for organizational purposes. I could do the same with the main here, right? So here I have a main element just for the layout here. I could technically create something like main. The only downside is now it hides the other three things that are actually going on, like the item list, like the to-do list and the sidebar. So now I would have to open up the main file to actually see what's going on there. So that's a bit subjective where you want to draw the line, but I think it's better to keep it like this, because now with just opening up one file, I can see pretty much all the main parts of the app, the to-do list, the sidebar. I can see everything from one place here. So as a best practice, if you can improve the organization of your code by creating a component, that's a good use case for creating a component. And in addition to that, if you have some kind of reusability where you have, let's actually go to those buttons. Yeah, so here we have the button component. We don't really have to understand what's going on here. The point here is we're going to have some JSX essentially here, this button tag only, but also a bunch of styling, right? You can see there's a bunch of styling here that's going to be shared for these three instances. All right, now about the button, it looks a bit chaotic because of all the class names here. But you can see we are using one component for these three instances. So here in this form, we have add to list. If I go to that form component, you can see here I have this button component. And also here in the sidebar, right? So then here we have a similar button. It should just be a little bit de-emphasized because this is not the main action that the user should be taking, right? This is the main action. These are like secondary actions. So here in the sidebar, here I have these buttons here. It's the same component, but we can customize it in a certain instance with props. So you can see I can pass here button type is secondary, right? So here in the component, we get button type. And then here, based on that type, we can just change the styling a little bit, right? Just making the opacity a little bit less so that it looks a little bit de-emphasized. And then also, of course, the text in the buttons should be customized. So in React, what you can do is you can use the opening and closing tags of a button, and then whatever you pass in there, so in this case just text, whatever you pass in there, you get that as a children prop. This is like a special prop, and that's just going to be what we display in between here. So that's why we can show different text for these instances. Now when I click here, we should submit the form, but when I click here, we actually want to do something else. So here there's actually some interactivity or some logic that we want to run, but it should be different in each instance. So you can see here when we click it, we just want to run whatever gets passed in here when you actually use the component. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it shows that we can not only customize the styling or the JSX or the actual text in a particular instance, but also the behavior when you actually interact with it. Right, so I would say don't be afraid to create components. As a best practice, try to identify opportunities for reuse, as well as when some element in the UI is distinct from something else, right? So here, this logo thing is different from the to-do list here. So those probably should be in two different components. All right, let's talk about the next best practice, which is to avoid unnecessary divs. So I see this a lot. Let's say we are actually creating a new button component, We already have one, so let's just say btn.tsx because we already have one. But just as an example, let's say you're creating a reusable button component. Very often, people will create a component maybe with an extension like I was just doing right now, and you will get some boilerplate like this, and then they will return a div, and then in there they will return. So for some reason, people keep the div in here, but that's not necessary. In fact, it actually has some downsides. So we actually do want to remove it, and since we don't need them, I can just directly return a button element like this. I don't need a div around there. Right? It's not like a component always needs to return a div or something like that. Right? So we can just leave off the div. All right, now here in the sidebar component, we have those two buttons. Right? So here we have these two buttons, and there's actually some space between them, vertical space. So we have a little bit of a gap in between here. So in Tailwind, I can use this class for it, but doesn't matter whether I'm using this space Y utility class from Tailwind, or maybe I'm using Flexbox or CSS Grid. There could be some layout styling here, so we can actually get a gap between them. Okay, so far so good. Now, what if we actually want to have some check here? So if the user is already logged in, well, we should not see these buttons, but we should see a logout button instead of these two, right? Because we don't want to show login when we're already logged in. So here we want to check if the user is authenticated. We can have some logic here. So if the user is authenticated, if that is true, we want to show a button component that is going to be for logout, right? And if the user is not logged in, then we want to show those two buttons that we have here. Right. Now, as you can see, we run into an issue here because in React, you cannot return two things. Right. So here I'm actually returning now as the else part of the ternary here. I'm returning two things, two components here. You cannot do that. You always have to return one thing also when you return from a component. So here it may be very tempting to use a div. Right. You think, oh, I need to return one thing, so I can just wrap all of this in one div, and then you're just returning one thing, which is that div, which in turn holds these two buttons, right? So now if we do this, we get rid of the red squiggly line, but now if you go back, you can see we actually screwed up our layout here. And that is because we are adding an unnecessary div here. This div is not necessary because we can actually also use a React fragment, which will not add anything to the HTML structure of the page. So this is a special thing we can do in React. If I do this, we don't have any red squiggly lines and the layout here is preserved, right? So when you're adding unnecessary divs here, it will clutter up the HTML structure. And the biggest problem with that may be that you are essentially breaking up the layout, right? So the layout styling here, also with Flexbox, with CSS Grid, it depends on the HTML structure. So if you add a div in between there, you may have a problem with the layout, right? So if you don't need a div, when you can just use a React fragment, try using React fragment. And in addition to that, if you add a div, sometimes you want to inspect here in the div in the browser DevTools as well. And if you add unnecessary divs in here, you're going to clutter up this part as well. So it will make it more difficult to understand what's going on here as well. So if you can, try using the React fragment, which is just this, right, which will preserve the layout because it does not add anything to the HTML, right? So if I go back here, you can see I have a div with space y2, and then directly in there I have these two buttons, right? So this div now is still the parent element of these two buttons because this does not add anything to the HTML structure. You can also write it like react.fragment if you want, but typically people prefer the shorthand like this. All right, so I have one very important one, which is don't add layout styles to your reusable component. So I could take the button example from the previous one, but we actually ran into this with my Evento project in my React and Next.js course. We ran into a very clear example of this. So we have the home page where we have this H1, but we want to have this H1 on other pages as well. So here on the this page here, I want to have the same H1, events in Austin, right? So I want the same H1, so I want to reuse that, right? So I'm using it on multiple pages, I'm using it in multiple places. So here we create an H1 component, and basically it just has some styling here. So then here on the home page, I can just say H1, and then whatever text I want in that particular spot, I can just write it like this, right? And then it will just pass it along as children, right? So we've seen that before with the button. But I also want the H1 on the other page. So here, events in Austin, here I want the same heading. So here I can just use H1, and then I can just write whatever text I need in that particular spot. All right, now what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that here the H1 looks good, and the H1 here itself looks good as well. But you can see there is some issue here with the spacing here. So here, these cards are directly sitting almost against the H1 here. So what I would like to do, for example, is I want to add some margin to the bottom of the H1 here to push this stuff down, right? So you may think, oh, this is the H1. I want to push this down, whatever this stuff here is. I need to push that down a little bit. So I want to add some margin on the bottom here. Well, that's the H1, so I can go here. So I go to the reusable component, and I'm gonna add the layout styles here. So here I'm gonna add some margin to the bottom, right? So now if I save, you can see indeed we have fixed the problem here. But if I now go to the home page, you can see we have another problem here, because remember, this is a reusable component. So it may work for one particular instance here, but now the margin on the bottom is also added in all the other instances where you're using it. So here on the home page, here we now also have that margin, and here I don't want that. So this is actually quite a common issue that I see, is people, they add layout styles to a reusable component, which is not what you want to do, because it will affect all the instances where you use it. So typically you don't want to add margin to a reusable component like an H1 or a button. You also typically don't want to add flexbox styles or CSS grid styles. You typically don't want to have that in a reusable component. So you want to remove it from here, which will make this look good again. But now, of course, we still have this issue. So how do you solve this? Well, I could, of course, add a margin to the top of the other component here, right? If you have some other component and you can add margin to the top there, something that's not reusable, that would be okay. Now, that's still not a great solution here, because here I'm using events list. I'm using suspense, but that doesn't have an effect here. But I'm using events list, and I also want this to be reusable. So I also don't want to add layout styles to this component here. So what you may want to do, you essentially have two options. You may just want to add a one-off div. So in this case, you may actually do want to add a div to the structure. Because what can I do here? I can just add the layout styles, particular one, right? Margin bottom 28. So now it's just a one-off div essentially that will contain all the layout styles that I just need for this particular instance. Now you can see this is fixed because the margin has been added, but here we still have the same style. So here there's no problem. We have fixed the issue. So you can add one-off divs if you need specific layout styling around a reusable component. That's one option you have. By the way, you cannot use a React fragment here, right? So React fragment does not allow you to add styles or something like that, because it doesn't get added to the HTML structure. So here we actually do want to add a div. Now that's still not ideal that we have to, add a div here. It's okay. This is, using a one-off div, I think, is fine, but I think there's even a cleaner solution. So what you can also do is we can remove this, and it would be nice if we can just treat this like a normal H1 element where you can do, for example, class name, right? I can just add margin to the bottom, 28 here. If I could just do that for this one, right? So if I could do something like class name, margin bottom 28, if I could just do it for this particular H1 and not the other one here, just this one here, that would also fix it if that would work, right? So can we make this work? And the answer is yes, actually. So this H1, we can actually just accept a class name prop, and we can modify the H1 component as follows. So we're going to accept a class name prop. Actually, it will be optional, because here, for example, in this H1, we don't want to add anything, so it will be optional. We will still have our base Tailwind classes, right? So the base styling. But in some instances, like here, for example, we want to add an additional class in that particular instance. So we're going to take the class name and we're going to merge it with the base classes here. This is easy to do with a utility called, the CN utility. It has been made popular in recent times thanks to shadcn, and it looks a bit complicated here. I will not explain it here. I have a separate video on that. Basically, it's using CLSX and Tailwind merge to intelligently merge whatever you're passing in with the base classes here, right? So essentially now, if I would inspect this here, you can see here in the class list here that MB28 has been added to this list of classes here, and therefore, the issue here has been resolved while not affecting the other instances, right? So this is one of the solutions you may want to prefer. I prefer this because now we can keep the component reusable while still having one-off styling in a particular instance without creating unnecessary divs or affecting the reusability of the component. So as a best practice, try not adding layout styles to your reusable component. Instead, if you need some kind of layout style, just use a one-off div or use the class name prop like this. All right, so I also think as a best practice that you should use TypeScript. TypeScript makes you code a little bit more strict. It helps you catch your mistakes a little bit faster, as well as it will give you IntelliSense as you use, for example, a component. So just to give you one more example here with these buttons. So here, if we go to these two buttons one more time. So here, I'm using those two here, right? So here I can pass a prop here, button type is secondary, and we can accept that here, and then based on that style it a little bit differently. Now you can see so far I've been using .tsx, right? So it's basically the same as JSX, but it has some TypeScript features here, and that's also why I had some red squiggly lines so far. So for example, I have some red squiggly lines here because I have not typed this. Basically the props of this component, we haven't specified what type this should be. Should button type be a number or a string? So here I can specify button props. I like to extract this out into a separate type. So I can say type button props. So here, by using TypeScript, I can make myself I can make it a little bit more strict for myself. So I want to say the button type, well, we could say it could be any string, but we can be a little bit more specific. Typically you want to be as specific as possible. It should only be the string primary or the string secondary. So we use a union type there. Now for onClick and the other ones, on children, it's not important for now. Basically, onClick should just be some function, and children is something called a React node. This is not important for now. I want to show you why I want to use TypeScript here. So now that I have properly typed this, you can see the red squiggly lines are gone. But what is the benefit of doing this? Well, now, if I, for example, make a mistake, because I think, oh yeah, should it be second, or should it be, maybe it's an info button, or was it button type auth? You can see when I make these, when I do not get the right one, so if I'm just guessing here, that should be an auth button type, which is wrong, TypeScript will warn me with a red squiggly line here. Right? So you can see type auth is not assignable to type primary or secondary. So now I know, okay, so this is incorrect. So I can remove this, and if I want to see actually what option I have, I can use IntelliSense here. So here on Mac, I can do option escape, and it will actually tell me that I can pass either primary or secondary here. Here, we also need to specify what we want to do when we click it. If I forget to do that, so if I just remove it from these two. So if I just remove it from here, you can see TypeScript warns me as well, because now it's saying, hey, onClick is missing, right? So here onClick is missing, so I can fix my mistake. Yeah, I need to specify something for onClick. And also, sometimes you use a component, maybe I'm just using the button here, and I know I need to pass some things. I'm not sure which props to pass. So again, I can use IntelliSense here, and it will tell me the things I can pass here. So button type, children, onClick, and key with a question mark is actually optional, right? Actually, we actually want to make button type optional as well. So I can just add a question mark here. But the point is here, TypeScript helps you. TypeScript will warn you when you made a mistake, and also gives you useful IntelliSense information if you don't know something. So in the world of React, you'll see it a lot with props for a component. As an app developer, you don't have to become an absolute TypeScript expert, but for props and sometimes useState, some of the state management solutions, those are some situations where TypeScript comes in really helpful actually. And so I would consider it a best practice to use TypeScript. Now, by the way, if you really want to master React and Next.js, I highly recommend that you go through my professional React and Next.js course. It has everything that you need to know, and we start from absolute scratch. And by the end, we're building some pretty sophisticated React and Next.js applications. So I highly recommend you check it out. You can find a link in the description. All right, another best practice is to keep your components dumb. So what that means is you want to keep them simple, essentially. So as an example, let's say that we have some kind of status bar here at the top. So if I check off one of the to-dos here, then we see this one being white for a third. And if I have 2 out of 3, we can see it's like 66%. And then if I mark them all as completed, it's 100% white, right? So this is some kind of status bar component. So we could hard code a number here, let's say 50, right? So then we would have 50%, right? So here, if I would write 50%, then it would always be 50%, right? Now what we want is based on how many to-dos are actually completed, that's how wide it should be, right? So here, I'm making a calculation. So here what I'm doing is I'm taking all of the to-dos, only take a look at the completed to-dos. So that filter will give us a new array, and we take its length. So this will be the number that specifies how many to-dos are actually completed. We divide that by the total number of to-dos, and then we multiply it by 100 to get a percentage, right? Then I'm just tacking on a percentage sign at the end, right? So basically what we're doing now here, well, we're not making the component simple. We're actually doing a, pretty complicated calculation in here. And if I do this, if I now refresh here, you can see it actually works as expected, but I would say this is not really good component design. This is not a best practice, because in order to make this calculation, we need access to all the to-dos. So we need to pass down all the to-dos here as a prop in order to make this calculation, which is not a good idea, because let's say we also want to use this status bar for when we're loading data. Let's say we're fetching data from somewhere, and that may take some time. And while we're waiting, we want to show like a loading indicator with this status bar. Or for example, maybe we have different pages and I want to show a loading indicator for transitioning to another page, right? So a page transition may take some time, and I would like to show like a loading indicator with this status bar as well. But now the way that we've designed this component is it's always going to use this to-dos variable here, and the width here depends on that calculation that we're doing here. So the problem essentially is we've made it too specific to one particular use case, which is a status bar for the to-dos, for the amount of to-dos that are completed. And we cannot really use it now for the other possible use cases, like a loading indicator for fetching data or page transitions. And this is actually pretty common. So what you want to do is, if you have a calculation like that, you don't want to do it in here. You want to do the calculation higher up in your component tree. And you just want to use this component by passing the percentage that should be its width. So here we can just say progress percentage. Right? That's the only thing you need to pass in. So you do the calculation somewhere else, and then here we will just use that variable like this. Right? So now it's more agnostic to a particular use case. It's more general now. I can use it now for the to-dos, how many are completed. So how would I use this now? Well, let's say we're using the status bar here in the app component, and let's say that we have the state for the to-dos right here. Now, if I want to use the status bar, I should not be passing in all the to-dos. It now accepts one prop, the progress percentage, a more general. And how much should that be? Well, if it's for the use case for the to-dos, we can make the calculation in here, right? So here we can say to-dos completed percentage or something like that. And we can do the calculation in here, and then here we will get some percentage, and I can pass that as the value here. So then what you get here is going to be something like 33 or 66 or 50, then the width will be correct. And now if I want to use the status bar somewhere else, and actually I can also write it like this, you know, just immediately in here like this, remove that. So this would technically also work. But now the benefit is I can also reuse this component for other use cases. For example, for a loading indicator, right? Maybe we're fetching some data and we're calculating how much loading time is left, something like, and here I'm just saying it's 50% or 50, but we would have some calculation for that. And now I can use this component for that as well, and then it would show how much percentage, and then it will give me an indicator here how much is left, right? But the point here is that this component is dumber now, right? Not as an insult or anything like that. It's not as complicated as before, because if you have a very complicated thing, it's usually very specific to a particular use case. So we have made it more general now, and as a result of that, it's more reusable. Keep your components, especially if they're lower in your component tree, or if they're reusable, make sure they are dumb. They are not unnecessarily complicated. They're as simple as they can be, which will improve their reusability and I think overall structure of the app. Right, let me undo this. Right, and typically that means if you have some kind of calculation or something that you're doing here, which is essentially derived state, right? So this is essentially this information here, to-dos completed, it's essentially being derived from some existing state that we already have. So people call that derived state. Typically you want to derive it just very close to where you actually have the original state. Right? Instead of somewhere down in your component tree, you want to do it very close to where the actual state is, and then you can just pass that as a prop. And actually here we should do probably times 100, right? So then we have the same calculation as before, right? So I would say this is a better structure. So now we have made this component simpler again. All right, so that was one example of having a component that was unnecessarily complex. There are some other situations where that may be the case. So let's say we are managing the state here, and when I submit this form here, we want to update the to-dos, right? We want to add one to that array. So maybe you would say, well, set to-dos, we need to set the to-do somewhere actually in the form. Now that form is actually sitting in the sidebar component here. So here you can see we have the add to-do form, right? And below there we have these two buttons. I removed some things. Sometimes I'm changing some things just to keep the example clear. So if you see something that has changed, that is why. But I think here we understand the idea, which is then what you may decide to do is you want to pass down that setter function, right? So very common for junior developers, you pass down that raw setter function that we get from useState to the sidebar, right? So then here we need to accept that as a prop, and then here we can pass it to the form, right? So, right, and then in that form component, you would accept that setter function as well. And then here, when you actually submit the form is where we could actually use it, right? So then here, when we actually submit the form, what do we want to do here? We want to set a new array with all the previous to-dos, basically update the state in some way, right? So you would add the new to-do in that array. Right, we'll talk about that in a second as well, how to do that properly, because we don't want to set it to an empty array, of course, but let's focus on the fact here that we're doing prop drilling here, right? So to get that setter function all the way from where we're actually managing the state all the way down into our component tree to the component that actually needs it, you could say, we have to go through one in-between component, which is the sidebar component here, which only accepts this as a prop just so it can then pass it down to some other component. The sidebar doesn't need this function. It doesn't need this setter function. The sole purpose of this prop now is just to pass it down. And this is not ideal because now we're making this component more complicated than it needs to be, right? So now we've created sort of like a chain from app to sidebar to add to do form. And now if you add another component in between there, well, you have to make sure you also pass the setter to that. And if you don't do that, you break the chain, right? So it becomes more like a fragile setup. So we are, again, unnecessarily making a component complicated because we can prevent prop drilling in several ways, actually. So people are very quick to use a state management solution like the context API or toStand or Redux. And those are actually all fine solutions to prevent prop drilling. Nothing wrong with that. But there is actually also an easier way. We can remove this. And we can just have opening and closing tags. And what you can do actually is you can then take all of this stuff in between here and paste that right here. Of course, I would need to import the components in that case, make this a little bit wider. Yeah, so now the sidebar will just receive all of this in between here as children. Right, so we've seen the children prop before, and we can now replace all of this with just the children, right? Just passing through the children here. So now the sidebar, as you can see, is much simpler. We don't have to pass it as a prop to sidebar first. We can directly pass the setter function to the add to do form here because it's already here in this file. Right, so you can use the children pattern to prevent that prop drilling as well, right? And in fact, we can do it for all the other components in here as well. For example, in the header here, we have logo and counter, right? So you can actually take this for a small app like this. You may actually just do this for a lot of these. So you would have logo and counter in here as well. And so you would essentially have all your components just in this one app component like this. That's one approach you can take. Now, one downside of this approach is, of course, that the app component does bloat up, right? So you can see it's already a little bit more messier now and bigger, and it's a little bit harder to see what's going on now. But that is one option you have to prevent prop drilling, right? So you can use that children pattern and just immediately pass the prop to the component that needs it like this. Now you can see everything here still looks the same because it works the exact same as before. And actually there is one performance improvement as well, which is that this component now, the sidebar, if it has some state of its own, or if this has to re-render on its own, previously what we had was all the other components in there would then also have to re-render. However, with this pattern, if we keep it like this, if the sidebar needs to re-render because it has some state, for example, it will not cause a re-render of the components in here. Right? So there's also a performance benefit in that case. It's not the case in this example, but I think that's good to know as well. The only downside is that the app component becomes a little bit more bloated. If you don't want to do this, you can also use the context API, which is actually what we're doing in this project in the course, or toStand or Redux. They all work very similarly. It's all the same in essence. Those are all more like state management solutions. Before you even go there, for a small app, you may want to consider following this pattern first and see how you like it. And actually, if you take that pattern and you do it for the entire app, we actually do that for the remote dev project in the course. And this is actually what it will end up looking like. So you essentially have a bigger app component, but the benefit is you can see everything that's going on in one component here, right? And if you were managing state in here as well, you could pass that as a prop directly to the component that needs it without passing it through header and then header top first. You can pass it directly to this bookmarks button, for example. Now, typically for state management, you want to go for the context API or useState or Redux. We talk about that in the course as well. So that's why you don't see that here, but you can still have it like this. And I think it's actually fine, right? So I really like the children pattern actually, because it gives a nice overview and it prevents prop drilling. Now for this video, I'll actually leave it like this. So it will just be the children pattern for the sidebar here, this portion essentially, and I will just leave the other ones like they are right now. So let's continue like this. All right, next one I want to show you also has to do with keeping components as simple as possible. So from this form component, we want to update the state, right? So when I actually submit a to-do, there is a submit event, right? That's what we're hooking into here. Now we're going to prevent the default because we don't want that refresh, but then we actually, of course, want to update the states. So we need to take whatever the user wrote and actually add that as a to-do, right? So what you want to do is we want to have a new array, of course, but we want to keep all the previous to-dos as well. So you would probably spread them out like this, and then we would create a new object for the new to-do, right? So we would have maybe an ID, maybe the to-dos.length or something like that, +1. The content and is completed by default is false. Right, so this is one way that you can update state. You have a new array, but you spread out all the other ones so that we keep the old ones and then we add a new one. Right, now the problem with updating it this way is that now we need access to the to-dos variable, right? So that is state that is not managed from this component. That's what we're managing up here. Right, this is just an example. I'm changing some things along the way to keep the examples a little bit simple. But the point is the to-dos here is managed here, right? And we're trying to update it from here in this way. So we need access to the to-dos variable. Now you may be inclined to just pass that as a prop as well, right? Basically, you're not really thinking about a structure. You're just passing props whenever you feel like you need a variable. So then here you would accept the to-dos like this. And then you can see it technically works. Because now we have no red squiggly line here anymore. The to-dos are actually available here. Now this also makes the component unnecessarily complicated. We don't need the to-dos here because with React useState, there is another way of updating state, which is with a function, right? So instead of using the to-dos variable, you actually get all the to-dos with this updater function, right? So we can take all the previous to-dos, we can just spread them like this, right? So here we can also use previous.length. So now I'm not depending on the to-dos variable. I can actually remove it as a prop. We don't need to pass it as a prop. And here we can also remove that as a prop as well, right? So this is a bit of a simpler one, but sometimes I still see this. With React useState, you have two ways of updating state. You can use the updater function, or you can just use it like we did before. But generally speaking, you want to prefer this functional way of updating the state when the new state depends on the previous one. Right, so here we want to keep all the other to-dos. So the new state depends on that, so we can use this. Also very common for counters, right? Count +1. Whenever it depends on old state, try using the updater function. All right, now a little bit more about passing down a setter function like this. I see this very often, but actually it's not what you want to do in my view. I think this is also not optimal because very often when some event occurs, like submitting a form here, we want to do multiple things. So for example, we want to add the to-do to the list. Okay, that's what we're doing here with the actual setter function. But there may be other things that we want to do. For example, maybe we have some kind of modal and we want to show a message to the user in that modal after adding it to the to-dos. So we may have some state for the modal. We may want to say something like, you have now added to-dos.length. Right, maybe some amount of to-dos. Please upgrade to Pro to add more. Right, so we want to show pop-up. Maybe if the user has added, let's say 10 this time. Right, so if the user has added 10 to-dos, we want to show a message in the modal. Right, so now we have some additional logic here, and now we want to set the modal open to true. Right, I'm just imagining some modal state. The point here is very often you want to do multiple things. So here we were only doing one thing, but in practice, very often you have additional logic when that event occurs. And now the problem is, of course, that we need access to the to-dos variable, right? But of course, also we need access to the setter functions for the modal, right? We have some modal state somewhere. And now this component suddenly is going to become very complex because we need to pass in a to-dos variable or to-dos prop, and also an additional setter functions, right? So you can already sense that this is also not a great structure. So what you want to do typically is you don't want to pass like raw setter functions. If there is an event happening in that component and you want to do something in that case, well, you may want to just create a handler function here that encompasses all the things you want to do. So here we can, for example, just say handle add to do. And so we're going to put all of that logic that we were doing previously in here. We're going to make this component much simpler again by removing all of this from this component. Right? This component doesn't need to know anything about modals. You want to keep your components dumb. They shouldn't know about all sorts of different things, right? So we're going to pull it out of there, and we're going to put all of that just here in one function, very close actually to where we are dealing with the actual state here of the to-dos. So now we have put all of that logic into one function here, the handle add to do. Right? I'm just naming it as in handling the particular event. We can also call it handle submit, but we can be a little bit more specific. We can say handle add to do. And this is the function now that we want to pass down to the component. Right? So here now, this is what I want to pass down to the to-do form. I will just call it handle add to do for now. So we only have to accept one prop, handle add to do. And now the only thing I need to do is just call that in this component here. This component right now doesn't need to know anything about how we're actually adding a to-do or other things we want to do, like doing things with a modal. All of that has been extracted out of this component. So this component is dumber now. And that is actually a much better structure because you can see this component is much more easy to analyze to see what's going on. And we have all of the state, right here I have to-dos, and all of the ways that I can update that state. I can create a dedicated function for that here, and then I can just pass that to any component that needs to invoke it, right? So we could also have one for handle edit a to-do, for example, right? We could have a function for that. And maybe delete a to-do, handle delete to do, right? But I'm actually clicking on the cross, handle delete to do, right? So now you have in one place the actual to-do state and also all the ways that you can update it and possibly other actions you want to do in that same update. So I would say that's a better structure. And actually here, if we want to update this, we do need to pass the content, right? So here we do need to pass the actual content of the to-do when you call that function, but it works the exact same. All right, now here I'm calling it handle add to do. So in terms of naming your props, typically people do tend to stick to the convention that you have in native HTML or JSX. So if you have like a button element on the page, if it has a click event, you have on click, right? So if you want to hook into that, and then possibly like handle click, something like that. Handle and then the name of the event. This is a pretty typical convention. If you have an input, you have something like on change, right? So click and change are like actual native events in the browser. So if you have a custom component like add to do form, you can also view adding a to do as like an event that happens in that component. So you may actually want to expose a prop called on add to do. When you design the component, you have to imagine other people will use this component. What kind of prop name makes sense here? Well, you can imagine that I want to let the user of the component know that there is like an add to do event happening here. And if the user wants to tap into that, they can pass a function. And traditionally, as we just saw, the convention is that you call it handle add to do, for example. Right? So then the prop name is actually on add to do. So then when that event actually occurs, that's also how you need to call that, right? So now this component doesn't need to know exactly what will happen when the form gets submitted. It only knows that when that form gets submitted, we know that's when we're adding a to-do. So that's when we need to actually call that function, and we do need to pass in a to-do content. How do we know that, by the way, that we need to pass something in? Well, if I actually type this with TypeScript like this, so on add to do is a function that takes in a string and doesn't return anything. So now here I get a warning from TypeScript, hey, you forgot something. You need to pass in to do content here, right? So here I can fix my mistake. So I would say using TypeScript is also a best practice. But now this is much cleaner. I think this is a much cleaner structure where you have a component and you need to think about a component in isolation from the rest of the app, right? So you have to think about what kind of prop do I want to expose here? So I want to signal to the user of the component, hey, there's like an add to do event here that you can hook into. And so when you want to do that and you actually do that, you can just do it like that. So it's in line with what you would expect from the typical HTML or JSX element. And actually I have another example here with passing functions like that as a prop. Right, so here, for example, we have this button component that we are reusing. Right, so here we have a button component and we have a bunch of base styles, right? So they all have similar styles. So here they all have similar styles, but if it's a secondary button, then we have some additional styles here, right? So here we can say secondary for these two and it will be a little bit different. Okay. Right, so that's what we're using here. We say button type is secondary for login and register. So that works perfectly fine. Now here, of course, if I click on login, something else should happen than when I click on register. Right, so here, when we actually click on this button, how would you implement that? Well, there's going to be a click event. So here we would have on click. Now for the login button, we may want to run a function called login. I'm getting that from my authentication provider, which I'm using Kind here. I'm a brand ambassador for Kind. It's a paid sponsorship, but I had a great time working with them so far. So here I can use the Kind hook and it will give me a login function. So when I click on there, it will invoke the login function. Okay, right. So if I click on there, it will actually redirect me to a Kind hosted login page. I haven't set it up for this video, so that's why I'm getting that. The point is, I have now implemented this for the login feature. Now, the problem here is that, of course, we're using the same component also for register here. So if I click here on register now, I will get the same result. That's not what we want. And the reason is actually very similar to what we had before, which is we're making this component too complicated. We're making it too specific to one particular use case to log in, right? Imagine you are designing this component and you know you're going to use this component in multiple places for multiple use cases. This is not how you would set it up. Right? So instead, you don't want to couple this too tightly to one particular use case. Instead, you want to expose an event, right? So here it would be the click event, just like we had the add to do event. Here it would simply be the click event. So you're telling the person that's going to use this component, the developer that's going to use this component, hey, there's a click event that's going to happen in this component and you can hook into that. And whatever you're going to pass as that function, right, on click, you're going to pass some function. We don't really care what it's going to be. We're just going to invoke it when that click event occurs. Right, so it's now a simpler, it's more dumb, this component. It's not complicated. It's a simple one, right? We can remove all of this. So now if you want to use that, here I can now specify on click. And here now I can specify a function just like before. What we're doing here, I could write it up here, but here let's actually just do it inline. That's perfectly fine as well. For this one, I can call login, and for this one, I can call register. Right, so now this component is reusable, and I can customize it through props. Right, so here we have now two different use cases for the same component. This component is going to receive whatever it's passed in as the on-click prop, and it's just going to invoke that right here when it's actually clicked. Right? And it doesn't need to know anything about login or register. It's dumber now. It's more simple, and the complexity has been lifted out of there essentially, and it's sitting up higher up. Right, so now I would actually have to use the hook here, right? Something like this. So we get login and register, and then here we can pass that, right? So I think the main takeaway is try to keep your components, especially lower in your component tree, or if they're meant to be reusable, like a button component, don't make them very specific to one use case. Try to make it more general, simpler, and you can do that by exposing certain props. So then when you actually use that component, you can specify the particular use case. Right, so that's how you can think about it. And these components, and in terms of naming the props, well, you can think about it as sort of like emitting an event, right? So here we're sort of exposing the click event. So when you actually use the component, you can hook into that. In this component, we're emitting a more custom event, an add to do event. So here we have on add to do, and if you want to do something, well, you can pass a function. Right, so it looks a bit complicated, perhaps. Now, I would say check out my course if you really want to master that. We practice a lot with it, with other projects as well. And we start from absolute scratch. I cannot explain everything in one YouTube video. I have to go through it pretty quickly here. But in the course, we built everything up from absolute scratch, step by step. So highly recommend you check that out if you really want to master React. You can find a link in the description. And by the way, every time this component re-renders now, for example, if the to-dos state changes, it will re-render. and therefore all of the statements inside this component function will run again. Right, so re-rendering just means that all of the statements inside this function body run again. And that means that this computation here is also done every re-render. And that may be a bit of a performance concern, right? So here would be a use case for the useMemo hook, right? So if you don't want to run this every time the component re-renders, you want to be a little bit more careful with that, useMemo. So useMemo here, we just have a function in there and it should just return the result of the calculation, right? So here I will just return this the result, and then what you get is the result in there, which we can call the same way. So let me remove this. So now in useMemo, it will not run every re-render, but sometimes it does need to be recalculated. For example, if the to-dos actually change, right? So we may have other state in here. A component may render for other reasons, and we wouldn't want to run this calculation if it's not necessary. So in this case, it's only necessary if the to-dos itself actually change. So in this example, it wouldn't be very useful, but if this component was re-rendering for some other reason, now this calculation would not be done every render, right? So useMemo is very often used for calculations like this, very often like derived state, right? So something that we derive from existing state like this, and we want to be a little bit careful with that so we can wrap it in a useMemo. Very simple. Now, as of recording, this is still useful to do, but in the future there will be the React compiler, which will do something similar for you out of the box. So in that case, it may not be necessary anymore to use the useMemo hook, but for now the React compiler is not in React yet, so we cannot use that yet. So using useMemo here, I think would be, I would say it's a best practice. And by the way it works in React is that every time this component renders, this function here is recreated, right? So every time this component renders sort of like a new function is created and assigned to this variable, and that's what we then pass down here. So just like what we saw previously with a calculation, we can wrap that in a useMemo. You can do the same with functions. If you don't want to recreate this every time, we can wrap this in a useCallback hook, and let me import that, and then we can specify when it should actually recreate it, right? So here we're saying it should be recreated when the to-dos actually change, but other than that it can stay the same. So then you should have a slight performance benefit. I mean, with small functions it's not a huge deal, but the benefit of this is now what you can also do is here this form component here, since previously it was always receiving a new prop, but if you wrap this in a useCallback, then it will not be a new function every time. Sometimes it's going to be the same function when it renders. And what you can do is you can prevent this component from re-rendering in that case, because the prop it will receive will be the same. And so in that case, we can use React.memo. So that's another function here that I can import from React. Sometimes people will write it like React.memo, but we can essentially wrap the entire component in memo and then actually assign it to a variable called add to do form. This will actually be the name of the component, and that is also what we export at the bottom. But basically now we have an additional optimization, which is that if the props are the same, this component will not re-render, so it's cached. And it's only possible because this function that we're passing is not going to be recreated every time, right? So now sometimes it's going to be the same, and so we can prevent an unnecessary re-render, right? So these are essentially the use cases for useMemo, what we saw before. If you have like an expensive calculation that you don't want to do every time it re-renders, you can wrap it in useMemo. Also for objects, for example, right? So if you do have some kind of object, here in the component function body, it will be recreated every time. If you don't want that, you can actually put the object in here as well, or an array. Not for state variables, by the way, those are not an issue. But if you have an object or array and you're passing that as a prop to another component, since they will be recreated every time, well, those components that receive those props will also re-render. However, if you would put those in a useMemo, right, so objects or arrays or a calculation, you can prevent those from being recreated or the calculations from being redone every time it renders. Right? That's the benefit of useMemo. useCallback is for functions. It's very similar, but just for functions. Right, so then the function here will not be needlessly recreated every time. So that's already a small performance benefit. But another benefit then is that if you pass an object or array or a function to another component, if you wrap that in React.memo, the props will stay the same because they've been cached either by useCallback or useMemo, right, in case of an object or array. useCallback is for function. So if the prop is cached it will be the same prop. And so with React.memo in that case, you can prevent a re-render of that component, right? That's in a nutshell how useMemo, useCallback, and React.memo work. So for React.memo, you need to use that in conjunction with useCallback or useMemo. It's a little bit complicated, and I have separate videos on this as well. When the React compiler comes, it can do similar things out of the box for you, so you may not need to use these anymore. However, as of recording, React compiler is not in React yet, so you may want to use some caching here as a performance benefit. I would say it's a best practice for if you have expensive calculations, make sure you use useMemo. And if you really have an expensive component that's difficult to render or that has a lot of things going on, you want to prevent unnecessary re-renders. So you can wrap it in React.memo, which will prevent this component from re-rendering if the props are the same. So you do need to make sure in that case that the props it receives, so for example, in this case, a function, that the function will not be recreated every time. Right, so you need to wrap the function in useCallback in that case. Or if it receives an object or array, you need to wrap that in a useMemo. Right, so a little bit complicated. So hopefully within the next few years, we do not have to think about this anymore because React should be able to do that out of the box. But for now, this is something to keep in mind. All right, let's talk a little bit more about best practices with the useState hook or state management in general in React. And we already saw an important one, which is that for setting state, you essentially have two options, right? So you can just set it to some value, but if the new value depends on some previous value, it's probably better to prefer the updater function format. So in this case, for set to-dos, when you add a new one, for example, you want to keep the previous ones, right? So here I want a new array, but I want to keep the previous ones, right? So I will spread the previous ones like this, and then I will add my new to-do here, right? And also for count, right? If you have some kind of count state, then technically we could do something like, well, you could actually specify a specific number, right? So then it would always become 10, right? Just 10. But if it should depend on the previous one, well, technically you could do count plus 1. But now you depend on this variable, right? So we've seen this before. What if you actually pass that as a prompt to some component? You also need to pass the count variable in that case, right? So that's not really a good structure that we actually don't even want to pass the setter function. But if you were to do that, you would also have to pass the count variable. But you may potentially run into other issues as well. For example, in closures, right? For example, here in a set timeout, for example, right? So here count will not behave as you would expect, for example. Right? So count will only be set once, right? It will not automatically increment because of closures. It's a bit of a tricky concept. I have separate videos on this, but basically there are some pitfalls with this way of doing it. However, if you were doing it this way with the updater function, it would work as you would expect, right? So as a best practice, I would say this is the option you want to pick when your new state depends on the previous one. Also, if you were doing like multiple setter calls right after each other, this will also not work as expected, right? So if you have, it's pretty rare, but if you were doing something like that, you also want to use this, and then it would actually also work as expected. React also batches state calls. So, and if you update it this way, that would also not be a problem, right? So basically there are a bunch of issues with updating state like this, where you depend on the previous state. So as a best practice, I would say try using the updater function when it depends on the previous state. All right, now sometimes for a particular state, for Booleans very often, I see sometimes that people will immediately use a Boolean here, right? So for isLoading, it can be either true or false. Maybe we're fetching some data and then we isLoading true or false. Now, you may also want to consider that in the future, you may have other states. For example, if you're fetching data, there could also be an error, right? So then what are you going to do? Are you going to have another piece of state for is error or is success? And in the success case, we want to do something. So now you have 3 pieces of state. So instead, what you may want to do is you want to have one piece of state and you want to just call it status, right? Set status. And maybe in the beginning, there is nothing going on. We can just say idle, and we can type this to tell TypeScript what options it could be, right? So we can have a type for this. Status could be idle, loading, error, or the success case, right? So we can type this for TypeScript as the status type. So now the status state here needs to be one of those 4 strings, right? So this is a union type, so it needs to be one of these 4 strings. So if we're actually gonna load some data, we can set the status to loading. And the benefit of typing this for TypeScript is if I make a mistake, if I try setting this to a string that does not exist, if I try setting this to a string that is not part of that type, TypeScript will warn me and will tell me, hey, this is not a correct string. This is not a correct string. It should be one of these four, right? So now I can fix my mistake. Maybe the data fetching gave us an error, so we can set the status to error, right? So instead of immediately using a Boolean, like is loading, is error, maybe you want to use a union type like this, right? I would say this is a slightly better practice, I think. It keeps the possible statuses confined to one piece of state. All right, so another best practice for state here. Let's say we have our to-dos here. It's going to be an array, right? And initially maybe an empty array, or we may have some to-dos in there. So we may have a bunch of to-dos. Let's actually just take two. Okay, so I have two to-dos in here, right? And that's how I'm keeping track of and actually let's say we have three to-dos here. So initially we may have like three to-dos and we may add more later. But for now, let's say we have three to-dos. Now, very often if you have a list of something, and here we're actually not using that, but let's say you can click on one of them, on one of the items in the list to make it active or to select it. Right? Maybe I can click on this and instead of toggling the completed status, we would see the details of that item, right? So maybe there were more details, a description. Very common actually when you have a list of something, you also have a way of selecting a particular item or make a particular item the active item. That's also a piece of state that we need to keep track of and we cannot derive it from here. So typically you also want to keep track of that. So you can say something like selected to do, and initially we don't have one, so let's say it's null. All right, now the issue is that I sometimes see is that when I now click on, let's say, learn React here, that means that the first to do here needs to become the selected one. How do you do that? How would you update the state here? So what some people will do is they will take the entire to do and make that the selected to do state, right? So they will invoke the setter function and they will set it literally to the entire to do, right? So that would be the to do with an ID of 1 and the text and the completed. So they would put the entire object selected to do, right? They would do something like this. So essentially the selected to do would now be the entire object. Let me actually write it like this. So now the selected to do is an object with the same information as the object here in the other state. So far so good. Now this is a bad practice because what happens if you actually change the to-do, right? So what happens if I can actually change the text of this to-do? Instead of learn React, I could change it to learn TypeScript, right? Just something else, right? I'm just writing it here, but in practice you would have the setter function again and you would have some way of changing that, right? The point is I could change the content or structure even of this to-do. The selected to-do, which was meant to be the same, is different, right? So this is not automatically updated when I update it here, right? So this is because I have two sources of truth right now. And in programming, it's very important that if it's possible that you have one source of truth. So here I'm trying to keep track of it. I'm trying to keep track of the same thing in two places. And so when you update one of those two, the other one is out of sync. And so then you have to remember that, well, if you change this one right here, you also have to change this one, right? So technically it's possible, but you can imagine you're gonna forget about that, or it's just it's a very error-prone structure to do it like this. So that's not what you want to do. You don't want to keep track of a selected item or an active item by sort of duplicating the object or array like this. Instead, you want to keep track of it by ID, for example, right? So a better way would say selected to do ID, selected to do ID. And then so if I click on the first one to select it or to make it active, well, we are just going to keep track of its ID, right? And now if this one gets changed, if it's going to become learn TypeScript, well, that's not an issue because we're still pointing to that same object. So whenever it changes now, well, that's okay because we're pointing to it. If we want the full object, we can derive it, right? So now if I actually want to get the full object, I can just take all the to-dos and I can find the to-do with the ID that is the same as that I have selected here. That is the same as what I have put in my selected to-do ID state. And that's how I get the complete object. And now whenever this changes, if this changes into learn view, well, that's okay because I'm still pointing to that same object. So if I need the selected complete object, it will still find that same object and it has been updated, but that's not an issue because I'm not trying to keep track of it in 2 or multiple places. I only have one source of truth, well, this same object still, and whenever that changes, well, that's okay, because I'm only keeping track of it by ID. And if I want a complete object, I can just find it by its ID, and I will get the complete object with all the latest data in there, right? So it seems a little bit complex perhaps, but the point is often when you have like a list of something, you want to have the ability to select a particular item or make a particular item active. Do it by ID, don't duplicate the object or array because it's a higher risk of getting out of sync. All right, so far what we've done is, well, we have one important piece of data in this app here. It's a small app, and the one piece of data is a list of to-dos, right? We want to keep track of that. We want to manipulate it, add a to-do, we want to delete ones. So that's one piece of data, to-dos, that we want to keep track of, that we want to be able to manipulate. And when we actually change that array of to-dos, we want a re-render, right? So when we add a to-do, we want to re-render that list so that we can actually view the new to-do, right? So we want to trigger a re-render, right? So the useState hook is appropriate for that piece of data, the to-dos data. However, there are some pieces of data in an app where you're better off not using the useState hook, but actually putting it in the URL. So a good example of this would actually be the selected color here, for example, for an e-commerce page. Right, so let's say you're looking at some product here. They have multiple colors available. Let's say I pick a white color for the shirt. You can see here it's actually being part of the URL here. It's actually a so-called query parameter. In that case, you would not create useState for that, right? So you may think, oh, I'm going to say selected color and I'm going to make that white or something like that, right? So that's how you would maybe do it in the app. Well, that is actually not what you want to do in that case. Instead, you want to make it part of the URL, and then not do useState, because then you would have that piece of data in 2 places. You want to have one source of truth, right? So the URL would become the source of truth, just the one place. And the benefit of that is you can copy this and you can share that URL with other people. So then the other person can paste that URL and they can press enter. And when they come to this page, they will see the exact same view as what you were looking at. Because based on what's in the URL, you're going to show the appropriate color. So in this case, you would show the white t-shirt image, right? So and if you were clicking on the black color, well, now that is part of the URL. So you can copy this, send it over to somebody else, and I can ask them, hey, what do you think of this black t-shirt? Well, they can simply copy that and paste that in the URL, and they would get the exact same UI. Also, somebody can bookmark this, and then so the URL, when they click on that bookmark later, they will come back to the exact same view here, meaning the t-shirt with the exact color that they were trying to get back to. Right. I can also add the size here, so you can see now it even is more. So now I have the color and the size as part of the URL. So if I want to save this for later, I can just bookmark this and I can just come back to the exact same view, exact same combination, because it's part of the URL, and the app will take a look at the URL and make the right selection here instead of using useState. Right? So that's not possible with using useState alone. Right? Here, I cannot make the to-dos, part of the URL. It's not really appropriate. But for some pieces of data, like filters, for example here, the color and size, or also like the page number, if you have multiple pages, try making that a query param instead of using useState. Some pieces of data are more appropriate for the URL. I actually have a separate video on this because it's a bigger topic, but I would consider it the best practice to make it part of the URL if you can, and it has added value for people that want to share it or bookmark it, and there are some other use cases as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about useEffect, a very mysterious hook to many people, but actually it's pretty straightforward. So when you call that hook, you need to specify 2 things. You're going to specify the function that you want to run, and secondly, how often you want to run that function. If it's an empty array, it just means that it will only run once when the component first mounts. So this function right now only runs once. Now what you may want to do in here, for example, is you want to synchronize, is a fancy word, your data in your React app with something that is outside the React app. For example, local storage. Right, so if I open up the DevTools here, if I can go to application here, and here I have an option here for local storage. So I can store things in the user's browser here in local storage. So what I may want, for example, is that as the user adds more to-dos or deletes them or edits them, that we persist that in local storage right? That I can put the to-dos in here. So then when the user comes back, those to-dos that they added or that they changed are persisted. So it's the same as when they left, right? Persisting data. So local storage is something outside my React app, right? So we have useState, that's all in my React app. But some things like local storage, that's in the browser, right? The React team does not control local storage or something like that, right? That's something that's outside React. So that is typically what you want to use the useEffect hook for things that are outside your React app and you want to synchronize them. So here I may have my to-dos state with all sorts of to-dos, and now I want to make sure it's the exact same in local storage. Right, so you may want to do something like this. So we put the to-dos in local storage, but now this would only happen when we first mount the component, which is kind of useless. So we want to do that whenever the to-dos gets changed. Right? The user may add a to-do or actually delete one, or maybe we have an edit button or something like that. So whenever it changes, we then also want to update it in local storage, right? Synchronize it with the data in local storage. So here in the dependency array is the fancy word for this array. We're going to add a variable now, and whenever it changes, it will run that function here again, right? That is in a nutshell the useEffect hook. That's how it works, and that's the purpose, right? So you have something that's outside React, and you want to make sure that the data in those two places is the same, right? As a beginner in React, for example, you also learn fetching data typically with useEffect. So basically you can view it as you have some data in a database somewhere, right? That is outside your React app. So with useEffect, we can make sure that the data outside the React app comes into our React app here. We can put it in state, and so we can synchronize our client-side app, React app here, with the server-side. All right, so there are some best practices, I would say, with useEffect as well. So you want to make sure that each useEffect instance takes care of one purpose, essentially. So what you don't want to do is do multiple things in the same useEffect. So for example, you may want to do something else in the app as well, which is maybe you want to listen for when the user presses the escape key on their keyboard, and maybe you want to do something. For example, if they have selected some to do and they press escape, we want to delete it, right? So you want to set up something in the DOM, or the window object, or the DOM. That is actually also something that is outside our React app, right? The DOM, the window, that's coming from the browser. That's not coming from our React app or something like that, right? So here we may also want to use useEffect for that. And so that's what we have here essentially. But now we have put this in the same useEffect as where we're trying to update local storage. And because we added the local storage here, remember this depends on this to-dos variable. And so we added that here to the dependency array. And so whenever to-dos change, this useEffect function will run. And that means that right now, whenever to-dos change, we are also adding this event listener to the document, even though this has nothing to do with the to-dos, right? So now we're going to keep adding whenever we change something here. If I delete one, right, the to-dos change. And since the to-dos have changed here, it's going to run this function again. And so indeed it will update local storage with the latest to-dos, which is correct. But then here we're going to define this function, and then we're actually going to attach that as an event listener again to the document, which is completely unnecessary. And you can imagine that this is not what we want at all, right? So instead, what you want to do is simply just invoke another one, right? We can just create another useEffect here. And so now they are nicely separated into their own useEffect calls, right? So you want to have one for each useEffect. All right, let's talk about fetching data in useEffect. This is what you're going to learn as a junior React developer. You're going to learn about data fetching with useEffect. So is it a best practice? Probably not, and I want to show you why. You typically want to do data fetching in a different way, but let me show you why that's the case. It's actually in the remote dev project from the course, we actually have a great example of this. Basically, this project, you can click here and it will show you a new job post. I'm actually using the same picture in the background for all of them, but we are actually seeing a new one when I click here. So you can see this one is front-end React engineer. That is indeed the title here. And this one is front-end developer. And that is indeed what we see here, right? So then we have Aspen Tech as the company name for this one, right? So when I click on any of these in the list here, we are making a fetch call to get all of the details of that particular job post, right? So these are all job openings. So this remote dev website is for, it's actually about remote developer jobs. So if you're looking for a remote developer job, you could find one here, right? So then if you click on any of these in the list, we're actually fetching the relevant details for that particular one. Okay, now how are we doing that? Well, we are using useEffect for that, right? So that we have some data on the server side, and now we want to bring that into our React app, right? So that's a fine use case for useEffect. So how are we doing that? So we define a function in here, actually fetch job item. We want to keep track of the loading state. So very simple, we just set is loading to true. And then we make an actual fetch call, right? So I have some base API URL, basically my bytecred.com domain. And then we need to know the specific one that we want to get the data for. So they have certain ID that we put in the URL. That's a best practice, as we talked about, right? Because now I can share this with somebody else. Hey, what do you think about this job post? And they will copy and open that up in their browser, and then they can see the exact same job post as we were looking at, right? We get that, we're keeping track of that here in the context API. We talk all about that in the course step by step, but basically we get some active ID from the URL. So that's how we get so that's the complete URL. So we will get some response, and then we actually get the data, okay? And that's what we actually set in state, right? So initially it's going to be null, but when we actually fetch data, we actually store that in state, and then we set is loading to false, right? That's just defining the function. We do need to actually call it here. Now here, the logic here depends on the active ID. So whenever this changes in the URL, that's basically how we're doing it. So when I click on any of these, we're changing it in the URL. And so this active ID will change because of that. And since it's part of the dependency array, we're going to make the fetch call again, so that we can update the state with the relevant job item. Right, that's basically how it works in a nutshell. Don't worry if you're a little bit confused. The point here is I'm doing data fetching here in useEffect, basically the traditional way, or the way that you learn it when you first start getting into React. Now, what is the problem with this? Well, let me show you this in a network tab. So if I click on the first one in the list here, you can see there is indeed that fetch call, right? If I now click on the second one, you can see there is a fetch call again, right? Actually going to the server and coming back again. But what happens now if I click on the first one again? If I click on the first one again, you can see there is another fetch call, but that is kind of strange because we just made that fetch call right here. Why do we need to make another fetch call for the data that we already received before? Right? It would be easier if we could just reuse that same data. Right, this is not efficient. What if I click on the second one that I already clicked on before? Right, I just clicked on that, and now we're making another fetch call for the same data that I already fetched like 10 seconds ago. Right, so as you can see, as I keep clicking on the first and second one, there is no caching here. Right, it's making a new network call every time I click there. It's not really efficient, but that is essentially what happens if you do it like that, right? Well, a better alternative would be to use, for example, React Query, which is what we're using in the course. So actually we create a custom hook here. You don't really need to understand how all of the custom hook stuff works. But basically, instead of useEffect, we're going to use a hook from React Query called useQuery. And actually we put that in our own custom hook, but there's a special hook. But the hook that you get from React Query is useQuery. And basically it allows you many things. It gives you many benefits, and we cannot discuss it in depth here. It looks a bit complicated, but the point is I'm not using useEffect anymore. Now I'm using that useQuery hook from React Query. If I now click on the first one, we are making a network call here, right? Because the first time, well, you need to get the data the first time. Okay, and now I'm going to click on the second one in the list. And again, it's the first time here now that I'm clicking on it, so it makes an actual network call. But now what happens if I click on the first one again? If I click now, you can see it instantly shows me the job item that we got the first time without making a new fetch call. And if I now click on the second one again, you can see it updates almost instantly here. It does not make a new network call because it can see, oh, you want to get the data for this particular job item ID. Well, we already fetched that like 30 seconds ago. So we can simply reuse the response from that particular fetch call, and therefore we do not have to make a new network call. Right, so you can see how fast this is, right? When you add caching to your data fetching, that is a very substantial improvement, right? So the third one, I didn't click on it before, so it has to get some data. And the fourth one as well, right? So the initial time it has to actually get the data. But now if I click on the third one, you can see, and the fourth one, you can see it's instant. And these are all instant now because the data has been cached. And there are many other benefits to using a third-party library. Instead of doing data fetching yourself in useEffect, you probably want to use a third-party library that has taken care of a lot of issues that come with doing data fetching in useEffect yourself. Now, in the course, we also talk about Next.js. Next.js also has a certain way of doing data fetching. It also comes with caching solutions out of the box. So in that case, you don't even need React query. So in Next.js, you don't even need React queries because it has caching out of the box. But there are some caveats. So if you really want to know about these things, I highly recommend you go through my React and Next.js course. We start from absolute scratch. We go through things step by step. So if some things here seem a little bit fast for you, that's okay. That's totally normal, actually, because it looks kind of complicated here. I understand. But once you go through the course, we do everything step by step. So I highly recommend you check it out. All right, so as a best practice, I would say if you're creating a React Vite app, probably you want to use a third-party solution like React Query or SWR by Vercel, or you want to use Next.js, which of course has many other benefits, but it also has caching for data fetching out of the box. If you don't really follow best practices, what I see, especially with junior React developers, is you get very messy, big components. So usually if you have a big, messy component and it's difficult to read what's going on, it's typically a code smell in my view. So let me just show you what happens in that case. Right, so let's say we have some to-do list component, just very similar to this. I changed this component a little bit to show you what happens without using best practices. So we have some state here, some useEffect, and you can see that's already kind of strange. What's going on here? Okay, so it's local storage, okay. But we have a lot of markup here. So here, for example, if there are no to-dos yet, we may want to show like an empty state, right? So if I delete everything here, we want to show something like this, right? So that's for that part. And then here we have the actual list. So we take all the to-dos and we create an LI for each one. You can see there's a lot of markup here. So there's a bunch of markup here, delete button. Let's see. And then here at the bottom, we have two more buttons, reset to-dos, and also here for marking all the to-dos as completed, right? So here I'm breaking several rules. So let's see what we can improve here. So first of all, as we talked about in the beginning, don't be afraid to create components, even if you're never reusing them. Components themselves, they clean up a lot of code, right? So if you have a bunch of markup, see if you can divide it up in smaller components. So for example, this part here, I can easily create a separate component for this. I could technically do it at the bottom here in the same file, right? Which is fine with me. If I'm only gonna use the component for this in this one file, I think that makes sense. I could also create a separate file for this. We can call it start screen or something like that. I have a React code snippet extension, so I can quickly create a component here. Actually, I will just copy this paragraph only, and that's what I'm going to return here. I'll delete this. And now I can use this instead of all this markup. We now will just have one clean component here. Essentially, we can just say, now I think this little piece here looks cleaner to me. And actually we are using a ternary here. I may want to use a logical AND operator, because then you don't have to write or null. So I think this looks even cleaner. And now you can see it's also much easier to see what that markup was for, right? Because with the name of the component, you're essentially telling what this markup is about, right? So it's just a very simple paragraph, but we have kind of labeled this markup now. So not only does it take up less space, it has also been labeled. Right, so let's see what else we can do here. So here we have a bunch of markup here for this list where we actually map over the to-dos. And actually it makes sense, I think, that you have a to-do item, which is going to be for the entire LI, right? So what I would do is I would create a file to-do item in which I will create a component called to-do item. So then here I would copy all of this, the entire LI here. I will copy that and just paste that in here. I can remove all of this and I can just use my to-do item component, right? So that's much cleaner. Now here we do need to pass all the information about the to-do. So we can actually just say to-do is to-do. I just pass it as a prop. It's okay. So then I could type this out, but I will keep it a bit simple here. And now you can see I've cleaned up that entire list by just creating a component for that markup, essentially, for that LI. That's all I did here. Actually, we do need to make sure the key goes and sits here for this. And actually, I think we can even write it without the return keyword on the same line. Yeah. Okay, actually it inserts, and actually prettier inserts parentheses for me, but you can see this is now much cleaner, right? And now, of course, right, I'm getting a red squiggly line here because to do has not been properly typed here. Let me quickly type this, right? So this is an array, but But TypeScript will try to infer what kind of array this is going to be. It doesn't know if it's going to be an array of strings or an array of booleans. And actually it's going to be an array of objects, right? With each object being a to-do, right? So here we created a to-do type in the course project. We can tell TypeScript, hey, it's going to be an array of to-dos. And so then we should get rid of the red squiggly line here. Yeah. All right. So then basically we could type this as well. But one other thing we can also do here is, let's see, like, because this is still quite messy, right? So there's a bunch of stuff going on here. Well, one thing we could do is, well, you can see there's another sort of like an independent piece here, which is a delete button. Delete button is semantically also kind of its own thing. In the course, we actually create a separate component for that as well. We're actually using the context API. That's where we're getting the delete to do function for. So this component is what we want to use instead of all this markup here. We can start cleaning up this component as well by just creating even smaller, more specific component, right? So here, I think that already looks better. And there is another thing here. This still looks messy. Right, so here we're trying to, when you get it to do, we may, for example, want to uppercase only the first character of the first word. Not all of the words, only the first word. You cannot do that with CSS. CSS will uppercase every word. So here we have a lot of like JavaScript magic here to make that work, which is kind of, well, which is not really great syntax. We can remove the comments here. Right, so here we created a delete button, which removes a lot of markup here, but also labels what that markup was for. So it's easier for us to interpret what's going on. And now we want to do something similar for this piece here, but this is not markup. This is more like JavaScript logic. So is there maybe a way that we can simplify this or like label it? And maybe also, of course, reuse it, right? Because now when I create a delete button component, if I need the same markup somewhere else, I don't have to duplicate a bunch of markup. I can just use the delete button component, right? So the way I think about reusability is if you want to reuse a bunch of markup, right, create a component out of it. If you want to reuse or clean up JavaScript logic, so not markup, but logic, for example, here for uppercasing the first character, you can try creating a utility function, right? So here I like to have a utils or helpers file. And here we can create a function, capitalize first letter, right? So here, this is just a simple JavaScript function and you can pass in some string and it will just take that string and uppercase the first part, the first character, right? So now I can use that function instead of all of that. I can just use that function here and then pass the actual to-do text, the content. Right, so now you can see it looks much better, but I have also labeled that logic. I can see what that logic means. Right? It capitalizes the first letter, right? So previously I had to parse myself. What does this actually do? I have to actually sort of analyze it myself and get to work to see what's going on here. Well, now I don't need to parse that actual logic. I have sort of labeled it by putting it in a separate function. And now I also get to reuse it in other places in my app, right? So here I'm only doing it in that to-do item, but maybe in some other place I also want to do the same logic. So now I have the same function that I can use elsewhere, right? So not only is it cleaner in terms, it looks cleaner, but it's also more reusable, that logic. Okay, so let's say we're satisfied here. Let's go back to this to-do list component a little bit more. So here we still have these two buttons, right? So very common for a junior React developer is they duplicate a lot. So here we can see there's a bunch of markup again. It's a button with the exact same styling that's duplicated. Well, we can create a component called button simply, right? I can just create button and replace all of this, and also all of this. I can replace all of this. I do need to import it here. You can see I have now replaced all of that markup with this button component. All of that markup has now been moved here and we're only writing it once instead of twice here, right? So all of that styling is in here. We've seen this button component before. Now, if you have a reusable component, we can still customize it in a particular instance, right? So the text in there, we want that to be different. We can do that like this with the children prop. And of course, if you click on this button, something else should happen than with the other button. So here we still have a way of doing that because we can just pass in what we want to do here because this button will accept any function here for on click and it will just run that when you actually click the button, right? So here we would want to do something like set to do to an empty array. And here this should be a little bit more complex perhaps, but all the to-dos should become marked as completed. And actually we could create a separate function for this handle click. And actually we could create a separate function for this handle mark all as completed. And actually to be consistent, we could also create a separate function for this, handle, reset, or something like that. We talk much more about this in the course, but now you can see, I mean, this function still takes up quite a bit of space, so I would probably go for it. So we can talk more about that, but this is already much better to analyze. It's much easier to understand what's going on than before. It looks much cleaner. And now if you want to use this button in other places in your app, in other components, we have a reusable component ready to go. Okay, so that is essentially reusing markup, right? So if you want to reuse markup, try creating a React component. If you want to reuse logic, right? So here what we did with capitalized first letter, try creating a utility function or helper function. If you want to reuse logic that has a React hook in it, we also want to create a utility function, but because it has a React hook in it, we don't call it a utility function, we call it a custom hook. So let me also show an example of that, because this is still a little bit tricky to understand. So what we essentially have here is we are trying to keep track of the to-dos in state, useState, but also whenever it changes, we want to update that in local storage. So we want to persist the data in local storage. So I know what's going on here because I took a couple seconds to really parse what's going on here. But it would be nice if we can also do something with this, and we can actually. So we can create a utility function essentially, but because there's going to be useState and useEffect in there, basically React hooks in there, it's going to be like a special utility function that we also prepend with use, because it's using React hooks in there, and it has certain, and therefore it's bound to the rules of React hooks. And we can also get rid of this and replace all of this with just this one line here, use local storage, and it will still give us exactly what we want, which is to-dos and set to-dos. But now we have replaced all of that code with just this one custom hook. And so now it looks much cleaner, but also we know almost instantly what's going on here, because the name of the custom hook already gives me that information, right? We have labeled that logic by using a custom hook, right? And also it's more reusable now, because if we have other pieces of data that we want to persist in local storage, I can use the same hook and I can define the key under which I want to store that data in local storage, right? So now this is also reusable, right? It's more general now than just to-dos. It accepts any key. Now I'm ignoring the TypeScript here. In the course we talk about this much more, and actually what I'm doing now here with local storage, I'm only setting the items, right? I'm not, when we're loading it, we're not getting the items back from local storage. You can actually do that immediately here in useState as well with a function actually. So you can actually also just do, so here we're setting the item in local storage, here we're getting the item. If you do, you can actually pass a function to useState. It means it will only do it once. So initially you will get the items from local storage when the component where you use the custom hook first mounts, right? So when it first mounts, we're getting it, but that's not really important here. The point here is we can even clean up code with hooks by creating a custom hook, and then it's also reusable. Right, so one more time, because I think it's really important. Just as a general rule, I think it's good to know as a best practice, I think, that if you want to reuse markup, try creating a React component. And if you want to reuse logic, try creating a utility function. And if you want to reuse logic with a React hook in there, try creating a custom hook. Right? Custom hook sounds so difficult, but it's actually just like a utility function with React hooks in there. But that is basically it. You can see this component now, I would say, looks much better. There are some TypeScript issues here, but we don't have the time to take care of that right now. But basically these were, I would say, the most important best practices in React. If you want to master all of them, check out my React and Next.js course. I hope this video helped you out. I'm Wesley, by the way. I'm a brand ambassador for Kind, which is a paid sponsorship, but I had a great time working with them. Check them out as well. In any case, thank you for watching. Hope to see you in my course. Have a nice day. Bye.